What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Fallout 1. The original Fallout is one of those iconic games that began the rather long legacy of the franchise that is the Fallout series. And that, honestly, makes it one of those titles that can be a little difficult to approach from a review standpoint because it's one of those things where it's like, what can I say about this that hasn't already been said? But nonetheless, I review a ton of CRPGs, I play a ton of CRPGs, and this is a game people ask me for my opinion about sometimes, so here we are doing this review. Now, I do want to mention that I am playing the Steam version of the game, which surprisingly enough actually runs pretty well. This comes with a high resolution pack, and unlike a lot of the older titles that you can find on Steam, you can just fire it up and it will run on modern hardware pretty easily. Up to and including 4K monitors, though playing this game in 4K is probably a bad idea as you can see the entirety of the maps. But Fallout itself was originally released in 1997, and interestingly, there was a ton of lack of faith, if you will, around its development. It was actually considered a low-budget project that wasn't expected to do well by Interplay, which is the company that published it, of course. And one of the more interesting little tidbits around that kind of low-budget approach is that the companions in the game are kind of notoriously bad with glitches and everything, and that is actually because companions weren't in the original design document. They were added later, and as such, they couldn't be coded into the game, and instead they had to run on a script, which is largely responsible for the problems inherent to companions in this game, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But the lack of a budget for this title led to a lot of little things like that, which is just interesting given how gigantic the Fallout franchise is now. But nonetheless, the game takes place in the year 2161 in an alternative history which saw a divergence of technology and fictional wars, which eventually caused the apocalypse, the widespread usage of nukes, leading to all sorts of mutated creatures. Some people, however, survived in vaults, and we, of course, start the game as one of those vault dwellers. Now, while I'm not particularly concerned about spoilers for a 25-year-old game at this point, reality is there are people who have covered the story of this game so incredibly in depth that I honestly just don't feel the need to. But there are, nonetheless, some things I want to mention about this story. Now, it primarily revolves around you, the Vault Dweller, searching for a water chip to save your vault. This, of course, leads into a situation with the mutants and the rather iconic confrontation with the Master. Now, in broad strokes, I'm a pretty big fan of the story overall. They give you a lot of very open-ended objectives that really kind of let you approach it any which way you please. For instance, most of the early game is you looking for the water chip. They don't tell you where to find it, they give you a couple leads, but by and large, you're allowed to just go figure it out yourself. In fact, it's possible to just stumble upon the actual location of a water chip, depending on how hard you're looking. Now, there is actually a time limit. These days, the time limit is pretty lenient. It used to be quite a bit more strict, but honestly, you could mess around a great deal and still pretty easily hit the time limit on finding the water chip before your vault dies. And if you take too long, one of the cities can actually change quite a bit if you get to it past a certain date. And while overall I don't think that's that crazy and it really doesn't change the story that much, that kind of thing is just not a mechanic you see games play around a lot with these days, which I think is unfortunate. I think that kind of line of thinking could lead to some genuinely changing scenery, if you will, when it comes to video games that no one really just seems to want to deal with. But while there are a ton of choices to be made in the original Fallout, I would say a lot of them lack a lot of immediate impact. A great many of them have consequences that you will see in the insides of the game, etc. And, obviously if you kill somebody, that's pretty impactful. But a lot of them are kind of just completing a quest one way or the other. They don't necessarily have a ton of immediate effect. There are actually quite a few different ways to approach the various quests throughout the game that aren't necessarily obvious all the time, which, combined with the game's relatively short runtime, leads to a lot of replayability. Because honestly, a playthrough of this game will typically run you about 10 to 15 hours. And while there is a lot to love in regards for the story, I do think, honestly, the writing is a little weak in certain places. Some things just feel like they're missing. Sometimes you'll resolve a situation and then no one will even talk to you about it. This can extend to even the tell me about option in conversations, which is sort of an older style thing you don't really see anymore. But in conversations, you could click the tell me about button, which would allow you to enter keywords that character can potentially know things about. but honestly, that's a pretty unintuitive system in and of itself, because things you would think a character might know about, they do not. And kind of the last thing I want to mention on the story front is that the Master in particular kind of seen as a notorious in-game boss, because you could potentially just talk the Master down and convince him to kill himself because his plan is doomed. Now, truthfully, I don't think his plan is doomed and that he was a little quick to jump to suicide. I think there were workarounds, but I'm not going to go into that too much. My main point with talking about this is that I think that moment is honestly the probably best thing that Fallout has going for it. And that moment in particular, I think other games have really failed to replicate, largely because they don't understand the work that went into getting that ending. A lot of games will give you speech options to potentially work your way around an in-game boss. However, what those games failed to do is implement it exactly how Fallout did. It's not enough to just have a speech skill to do this in Fallout. You have to actually have learned the information that will lead you to that ending, and then successfully navigate that conversation. So it's a combination of exploration, learning things through that exploration, and then finally putting them all to use in that conversation. It was not a matter of just having a speech skill and walking up to the guy. And I think a lot of games fail on that front, which in my opinion is kind of the most remarkable thing about Fallout's story, is how well that one thing was done. But moving on, let's talk about character creation. So this, of course, uses the Fallout Special system, but this was the first iteration of that system, hence why it's called the Fallout Special system. Now, you can actually pick a pre-generated character, but I don't know why you would do that. I think most people are going to make a custom character for themselves. And the bones of this system are very recognizable. You pick your attributes, this will affect your skills, and you can also pick traits which give you a benefit at the cost of a detriment. And then later, as you're leveling up, you'll get to pick up perks which really help define your build. Now, these are concepts I would say just about everyone is very familiar with these days, but this particular iteration of the system, being its kind of first draft, are a bit unrefined. There are skills that aren't particularly useful. Some of the balance of it all is just broken. The usefulness of one thing versus the other can be vastly outweighed. For instance, the outdoorsman skill is basically useless. It comes into play more in Fallout 2 than it does here, but it affects very, very little in Fallout 1. In fact, if you have more luck than 8, you genuinely don't need the outdoorsman skill at all. And then there's the fact that you can raise skills up above 100%. So the skills, of course, have these percentages, and you can raise them above 100%. It goes up to 200%. That is mostly useless for all of them. There are very few things that require having a skill above 100. The primary exception to that is weapons. Having weapon skill above 100% will actually increase your accuracy even farther. So in combat, there's actually a lot of penalties to your accuracy depending on the situation, be that nighttime, the terrain, distance, etc. Weapon skill over 100 can compensate for those penalties, but even then, depending on the type of weapon you're using, it's not even necessarily worth it either then. Overall, I'm actually a big fan of the special system. I think it's a very snappy, easy to understand role-playing system that most people have a grasp of, even if they look at it for the first time. This particular iteration, though, kind of does show its age with the fact that a lot of it is just very poorly balanced, which is the main thing to know about it. Now let's move on to world building. And truthfully, world building is probably the best part about this game. Now, the game itself uses the classic world map to travel to individual locations. While traveling the world map, you can run into random encounters. But from the second you leave the vault, you are free to roam and do whatever you want, honestly. It's very open-ended in that way. But they did a fantastic job of building a somewhat believable world with decent amounts of little civilization. You'll find little towns that have sprung up and are just doing the best they can, but they're having to deal with raiders and things. And then you combine these elements with the stuff you can kind of just stumble upon, like Doc Morbid, chopping up and selling bodies as meat, or the Thieves Guild that you can find in the hub, which feels a little out of place, but weirdly quirky, and I'm a fan. You look at the way the game handles death claws, which are kind of talked about as like this urban myth, until next thing you know, you're fighting some of them. And when it comes to world building, Fallout 1 did it so well that it became the benchmark of what the post-apocalypse setting is. Everything down to the very unique UI, to the flavor of the towns and things you'll be exploring. They just nailed the world building. They nailed it so well that to this day, this game still holds up. And while yes, some of it is getting a little clunky, this is actually one of the easiest older games to play. And while it's hard to point to any one specific thing and be like, this is why, it's really just a culmination of all of these things arriving at their finished product that makes for a really interesting and immersive world, even if parts of it are definitely starting to show their age. You can see by just playing through this game one time why this became the franchise that it became. Now, let's talk combat a little bit. Combat is super basic. It is an action point turn-based system where all of your movement and attacks cost action points. You can have up to 10 action points, which is primarily based on your agility in this particular iteration, and you spend those points to attack, move, etc. And enemies will do the same. Now, one thing that I really appreciate is that you can go into the options and turn up the speed at which combat passes, which helps alleviate some of the slowness often associated with turn-based combat. And while the combat is pretty solid, it's very simplistic in a lot of ways. They did a decent amount with it. You can, throw grenades, you can set up traps for enemies to potentially walk into, that type of stuff. It nonetheless has a lot of quirks that make combat, ironically, kind of the least enjoyable thing about the game. For instance, if you are using burst fire with basically any weapon, or even single shot, but there is, for instance, a friendly target within the vicinity of the target you're trying to hit, you have the potential to hit that target, which will turn friendlies hostile and force a reload. It's possible for your companions to shoot you, but it's also possible for enemies to shoot and injure themselves this way. In fact, in one battle, I had a rad scorpion critically miss and kill itself, which was a hilarious mental image. Now, in terms of progression, the itemization of things is relatively straightforward. While there is a decent mix of guns and weapons and things, at the end of the day, a lot of stuff is just a straight upgrade over the earlier versions of similar things, which makes a pretty straightforward progression in terms of gear. And while certain builds will lean into certain types of weapons, those types of weapons tend to have a very clear-cut progression due to the overall lack of variety with the weapons themselves. But honestly, that just kind of lends to the easy-to-jump-into gameplay of this game. Now, when it comes to companions, there are technically 4 of them, most of which don't really matter much. They don't really have much in the way of a story. Probably the most notable is Dogmeat, who has become a bit of a franchise staple, although obviously different iterations of the dog. But there's Dogmeat, Ian, Tycho, and Katya. They all have very little in the way of backstory. Most of them weren't really expected to survive. And truthfully, most of them are more trouble than they're worth. They can actively block your character's path, especially if you have all of them with you at once. There are tons of glitches around using them and giving them things. They will very often shoot you and do more damage to you than the enemies themselves. And while if you can work around some of the quirks of companions in this game, they can be useful, overall they tend to not be worth the hassle. Now, all of the factors that I've been talking about up to this point all kind of largely culminate in a game that is short, fun, and replayable. And while it does have its sore points, in my opinion, they're pretty easily overlooked because of how well the game does other things, which lends itself to a game that wants to be replayed to try out a couple different play styles or see how things would have happened if you did something else. And while because of the runtime and everything of the title, I do think there is a, relatively speaking, tight number of options, it does still serve as just a fun, short, replayable experience to this day. Which leads us to some pros and cons. So, pros, as I just mentioned, short, replayable, lot of fun. 2, the game holds up incredibly well. So I have played a lot of CRPGs from that era, and Fallout is probably the one that holds up the best in terms of gameplay, voice acting, story, etc. If you're looking to play classic CRPGs, Fallout is, without a doubt, probably the single easiest one to just jump into. Combine that with the Steam version actually being playable, the high-res pack that's readily available, the solid story, and you can have a great time with this game for a very small amount of money, usually less than $10. And on top of it, you'll be learning a ton of Fallout lore firsthand and see where a lot of this stuff comes from, which is really fun. Now, the cons, for me personally, the save system of this game really sucks. So there is no autosave or anything, you have to manually save. There's only 10 slots to manually save with. If you save in combat, your save file is almost guaranteed to become corrupted. which largely leads to the fact that while the game does hold up very well, there are definitely parts of it that are aging, which can unfortunately be a little frustrating. Now, in terms of a conclusion, Fallout 1 is a fantastic, short, replayable game that you can buy for a very cheap price, and it's one of those games that's kind of just a mainstay of gaming. While you certainly don't need to go back and play it, there's a ton of history surrounding this game, its genre, the Fallout franchise, etc., and I think that is very much so worth a look for the people that are curious about those things. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, maybe even consider joining the channel as a member. But regardless of any of those things, truthfully, just thank you so much for watching, especially if you've watched all the way to the end here and you're listening to me ramble on. I truly do appreciate it. You guys are what allows me to do this for a living. And for that, I can never be thankful enough. So thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.